The base was abandoned in 1992, but not before its creators left behind a few parting gifts: buried stockpiles of weaponized anthrax, forgotten test sites, and tons of contaminated equipment. All of it was entombed, sealed away under one big assumption: that the vast Aral Sea would act as a permanent guardian, isolating this nightmare from the world forever. That assumption has evaporated. Because once you really understand the pattern here, what they built, why it all fell apart, and what's crawling out from the wreckage, you'll realize this isn't just some forgotten chapter of Soviet history. This is a live biosecurity time bomb, and its geopolitical tripwires are stretching across one of the most volatile regions on the planet. So, how on earth did this happen? To get it, we need to rewind to the late 1940s, to the very dawn of the biological arms race. The United States had a program, so, of course, the Soviet Union needed one too. And both of these superpowers were absolutely consumed by a single, terrifying question. If they unleash a plague, can we hit back with one of our own? The Soviets had research institutes, sure, but here was the problem. Everything was too close, too visible, and way too vulnerable to spies or, even worse, a catastrophic accident. No. They needed something else. They needed total isolation, absolute paranoid secrecy. They needed a natural fortress. And then they found it. Vozrozhdeniya Island, or Rebirth Island, floating in the middle of the Aral Sea. Think about it. Spanning over 200 square kilometers, it was a sterile, sun-scorched landscape surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of open water. It was the perfect prison for the world's most dangerous diseases. Western intelligence couldn't get close. An outbreak couldn't escape. It was the ideal spot to cook up an unstoppable biological arsenal, the kind that guarantees no one messes with you. The program was given a deceptively bland code name: Biopreparat. Its mission? Anything but bland. The goal was to test the lethality of weaponized germs in the open air. Their to-do list was the stuff of nightmares. Create weaponized anthrax that could be sprayed from a missile. Engineer new strains of plague that were resistant to antibiotics. And, this is the truly chilling part, produce smallpox on an industrial scale long after the rest of the world had celebrated its eradication. This was the twisted logic of biological warfare. A silent, invisible, world-ending punch. But before you can build that kind of arsenal, you need a laboratory that's also a fortress. Enter the city of Kantubek, built right on Vozrozhdeniya Island. This was the proof of concept. Could the military actually build and run a top-secret scientific community in one of the most remote places on Earth? The environment was brutal. Summer temperatures shot past 40 degrees Celsius. Vicious sandstorms could blind you for days. And the only way in or out was by ship, which made getting even basic supplies a constant struggle. So, what did they do? They built an entire self-contained world. The military put up a sophisticated lab complex, sprawling pens for test animals, monkeys, sheep, donkeys, and a huge open-air testing ground they called the field. Then they built a town, complete with apartment blocks, a school for the scientists' kids, and social clubs. Every person, every piece of equipment, and every vial of something deadly was ferried in under the tightest possible security. The island even had its own high-tech airfield, one of only 4 in the entire Soviet Union, with a runway paved in interlocking hexagonal concrete slabs. For over 40 years, this place, known as Aral Sea, was the beating heart of the Soviet bioweapons program. Hundreds of scientists and soldiers lived there, their very existence a state secret. Daily life was a bizarre paradox. On one hand, it was a sleepy little town where kids played in the streets. On the other, it was a place surrounded by military patrols and labs filled with agents that could wipe out millions. The psychological strain of working with invisible killers, combined with that crushing isolation, was immense. The state wasn't just worried about foreign spies. They ran counterintelligence programs to ensure the absolute loyalty of the people who held the fate of the world in their hands. And by their standards, Aral Sea worked perfectly, which meant Biopreparat was a terrifying success. Now, here's what the rest of the world wasn't supposed to know. Aral Sea wasn't just a research station. It was the final destination in a secret network designed to produce thousands of tons of biological agents, a flagrant violation of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which Moscow had signed. It was all a lie. Defectors later sketched out the horrifying full picture. Factories across the USSR would brew up the deadly agents, which were then shipped to Vozrozhdeniya for testing and storage. They would literally explode anthrax bombs over tethered monkeys, just to time how long they took to die. In 1971, their weaponized smallpox got out, escaping the lab, infecting 10 people and killing 3. The whole operation was a biological shell game. Even if Western spies suspected a factory in Siberia was making anthrax, the real dirty work, the weaponization, the testing, was happening on an island they simply couldn't see. But there was a flaw in the plan, a catastrophic one. And it wasn't a spy or a defector. It was the environment itself. The Soviet Union's security, in this case, depended entirely on the Aral Sea. But at the exact same time, another colossal Soviet project was underway, a plan to turn Central Asia into a cotton-growing machine. And that plan required diverting the 2 massive rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, that fed the sea. Those rivers were being bled dry for irrigation. The Aral Sea was literally shrinking. The island's natural moat was evaporating year after year. The engineers of the bioweapons program were on a direct collision course with the engineers of Soviet agriculture. And incredibly, nobody saw the disaster coming. The end, when it came first for the Soviet Union itself. By 1991, the empire was collapsing, and the bioweapons program was frantically dismantled. The base on Vozrozhdeniya was officially abandoned in 1992. But before they left, they had to clean up, or rather, cover up, the evidence. Tons of live anthrax slurry were mixed with bleach and dumped into 11 giant pits in the ground. They walked away, confident that the island would remain isolated and the anthrax would eventually just fade away. You can probably guess what happened next. Check that assumption. Here's what they left behind. An estimated 100 to 200 tons of that anthrax slurry, just sitting in shallow pits. Countless animal carcasses infected with everything from plague to tularemia. Contaminated lab gear, glassware, and buildings. Oh, and unexploded bombs from all their weapons tests. For years, this toxic legacy was guarded by nothing more than the shrinking sea. The thinking was still ironclad. The water is a permanent barrier. And then, the man-made drought completely rewrote the equation. In 2002, a US-funded project led by a scientist named Andy Weber landed on the island to figure out just how bad the situation was. What they found sent a shockwave through the international community. The Aral Sea had shrunk so much that Vozrozhdeniya Island wasn't an island anymore. It had become a peninsula. A finger of land now fully connected it to the mainland on its southern side. The buried anthrax was no longer locked away by water. It was accessible by foot. That discovery triggered a mad scramble. The US and Uzbekistan launched a multi-million-dollar cleanup operation. For months, teams in full hazmat gear dug up the anthrax pits, cooking the slurry in a giant high-temperature reactor to neutralize it. By the end of 2002, they declared the main sites were secure. So, we all got a reprieve. Maybe. But that feeling of relief depends entirely on one hope. The hope that they found it all. We know they didn't. Subsequent reports and satellite images showed that the abandoned town of Kantebek was being torn apart by looters, scavenging for scrap metal. Who knows what contaminated materials they carried back with them? Worse, the 2002 cleanup only ever focused on those known anthrax dumps. It never addressed the entire island, an island that was used as an open-air test range for 40 years. Trusting that a few months of cleanup erased all that is like trying to sterilize a battlefield with a toothbrush. It isn't a plan, it's a prayer. And in recent years, the ghost of this island has started walking again. Declassified reports and new studies are debating whether those buried spores are still viable. Researchers tracking the massive dust storms that now blow off the exposed seabed, a brand new desert called the Aralcum, worry that live spores could be carried for hundreds of kilometers on the wind. The forgotten island wasn't gone. It was just waiting. And that waiting has created a legal and political nightmare. Seriously, who is responsible for this mess? Russia, as the successor to the Soviet Union, built the thing and then walked away. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan now technically own the land the island is split between. The United States paid for the cleanup, but has zero sovereignty there. And the local governments in the region, who are already impoverished, have no resources to manage a former top-secret death lab. International law is great at preventing people from making new bioweapons, but it gets dangerously fuzzy on who has to clean up the legacy waste of a dead superpower. As one security expert, Jessica Green, put it, Aralsk 7 was built in secret by one country, on land now governed by two others, was partially cleaned up by a fourth, all while the geography itself was being rewritten by an ecological disaster. So, who pays the bill? Back in 2002, Uzbekistan partnered with the US Department of Defense. Russia, for its part, has remained almost completely silent, offering nothing. And this whole mess is unfolding in a region that borders Afghanistan, a powder keg of geopolitical instability. The risk is no longer just some tragic accidental outbreak. It's that the materials, or even just the knowledge, could fall into the hands of terrorists. Vozrozhdeniya isn't just an environmental problem anymore. It's a symbol of unresolved Cold War baggage in a region where global powers are once again playing chess. And here's the final, brutal paradox in all of this. The facility built to weaponize nature was ultimately exposed by a different Soviet attempt to control nature. The grand plan to grow cotton in the desert is what killed the Aral Sea. And that ecological collapse, one of the worst of the 20th century, is what ripped the veil of secrecy off one of the Cold War's deadliest programs. A base designed for biological warfare was ultimately undone by botany. You just can't make this stuff up. So, here's where we are today. A secret Soviet city of plague lies exposed in a Central Asian desert. It once held the keys to Armageddon. A partial cleanup a decade ago may, or may not, have dealt with the worst of it. 3 nations are locked in an unresolved debate over who's responsible. And all of it sits in one of the most strategically sensitive regions on the planet. Aral Sea is the perfect, terrifying symbol of Cold War arrogance crashing into ecological reality. Decisions made with an assumption of total control are now having consequences nobody could have predicted. The smart question isn't if this will become a crisis. It's, when it does, who will be in a position to control the fallout? Because whoever frames this story as a Russian liability, a Central Asian security problem, or a global proliferation threat, gets to write the biosecurity rules for the next century. You're watching history's toxins become tomorrow's threat in real time. If you found this valuable, share it. Most people have no idea there's a plague island that's now part of the mainland. And that's not an accident. Thanks for watching.